Welcome to today's Cybersecurity Insiders webinar on SIEM worst practices, how to sidestep common mistakes and unlock SIEM's true potential. Today's webinar is brought to you by Netzurion, a leading provider of managed network connectivity, security, and compliance solutions. In this webinar, we will discuss the results of a recently conducted survey that highlights SIEM trends, right, and real-world challenges. And we will learn how to sidestep and overcome common mistakes to realize the true potential of SIEM. My name is Holger Schultze. I am the CEO and founder of Cybersecurity Insiders, the online community for cybersecurity professionals, and I'll be your moderator today. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our featured presenter, Ananth, Chief Strategy Officer at Netzurion. Welcome, Ananth. Thank you for presenting today.
Thank you, Holger. Good day, everybody. Nice to be with you.
Thank you, Ananth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Cybersecurity Insiders and Netzurion recently conducted a comprehensive survey, right, of cybersecurity professionals to learn about the state, if you will, of SIEM in 2019. And during this webcast, we will look at some of the key findings to better understand the state of SIEM adoption, key hurdles to more effective use of SIEM, and how to overcome them. First, we asked our survey participants, how important really is SIEM to your organization's security posture? The answer is very clear. SIEM plays a very to extremely important role in organizations' security postures, according to 76% of IT security professionals. That is a pretty clear indication of importance, right? But the question is SIEM, is it truly effective? Well, let's see what our survey participants said. And here's a picture that isn't quite as optimistic, because as you can see, half of the respondents felt that their organization is using SIEM only somewhat effectively or worse, right? The question now becomes, what are the specific hurdles, right, and shortcomings that cybersecurity professionals see, between the promise of SIEM and the reality? Our survey panel said that the lack of skilled cybersecurity staff to operate SIEM platforms is by far it's the single biggest bottleneck, right, to more effective use of the platform, 40% here. This is followed by, the need to manually create or refine rules with many platforms, right? That's tied with a lack of budget, and assuming that's for, qualified staff and technology investments, both at 34% here. And that's followed by IT professionals, cybersecurity professionals, just simply being overwhelmed by too many false positive alerts, right? Causing alert fatigue and seriously, misallocating resources and attention. Ananth, how does this, what we're seeing here, how does this reflect the reality you are seeing in organizations, right, when it comes to SIEM and security operations? Ananth?
Great question, Holger. And frankly, this survey reflects the state of SIEM at RSA, which is a security show that's going to happen next week in San Francisco. SIEM is regularly voted as the technology most likely to become shelfware, which is disappointing, given the fact that 75% say it's a very critical thing for as part of their security regimen. Why then is it so difficult to get value out of it? So I wanted to take the time to explore this question in some detail. We've been working on SIEM and SIEM-related technologies for more than a dozen years now. So we've learned a thing or two, and we'd like to share that with you so that you can get better value out of SIEM. So a little bit about us. As Holger mentioned, Netzurion provides secure, resilient, and compliant networks, and we have won a number of awards. But specifically, insofar as it relates to SIEM, our Security Operations Center has been doing this for a dozen years or so. We have installed thousands of SIM platforms across the world. We're currently shipping version 9.1 of our platform, having spent nearly 12 years in development. And we've stood up our own security operations center. We're monitoring a large number of endpoints, receiving and processing upwards of 16 billion logs every day. We've also been in the Magic Quadrant, a Gartner construct for SIM, for the last 11 years. So the foundation for these observations that we're going to make is coming from this experience and background that we've had with SIM. So before we launch into what makes SIM a good or a bad thing, how about we take a step back and ask, why do you even need SIM? Why did 76% of the people say SIM is a necessary thing? Well, in today's security landscape, it's a foundational technology for network security. And of course, the network is under attack from both insiders and outsiders. And the consequences of allowing that attack to be successful can be quite painful for the enterprise. And so SIM's primary mission is to do threat detection and to enable incident response. So if you're interested in figuring out what bad things are happening, could be happening in your network, and you want to have enough information to do something about it, why then SIM is where you need to go. Needless to say, if you're in the early stages of your development and you're just barely figuring out what a network is, then SIM may be a bridge too far. So SIM is best implemented when you've done the very basic things already, which means you've implemented some endpoint protection, you've implemented firewalls, you've done network segmentation, you've thought about protecting your passwords with something like Active Directory. If you've done all of that, then you're ready for SIM, and you want it to help you with threat detection and being able to respond when bad things are happening in your network. Sometimes the motivation for SIM doesn't come directly from security, but comes from its cousin, and that's compliance. Many compliance standards mandate that you should have log management, and you should be able to review and audit what is it that happened. And so some people back into SIM by actually coming at it from the compliance standard first. And that's a perfectly valid way of getting to SIM. And it's another use case that's important in the SIM universe. A definition of a SIM is something that collects and manages data from complex log sources. Lots and lots of log sources. Increasingly these days, they tend to be cloud-based. And we have to handle really large, or in today's environment, I guess, huge log volume coming at us in a high velocity. And we have to be able to use advanced analytics to make sense of it. The days of being able to manually process logs at that volume long since over. And so things like machine learning have made their way into the SIM lexicon. There are new words that have come up in the last few years. User entity and behavior and analytics is one such word. Look at the data in order to identify what's anomalous, what entities are behaving in an out of ordinary manner. That's what UEBA is. And then, of course, there is SOAR these days, which is security orchestration and the ability to not have to do everything manually, but maybe kick off remediation automatically through some type of playbook. So this is what a SIM is in 2019. If you knew SIM 5 years ago, well, the current SIM is nothing like the SIM of 5 years ago. There are much more requirements, fancy requirements vis-a-vis log sources, and much more demands in terms of processing and output. So some common misconceptions about SIM, which make for frustration on the part of vendors like us and people that go to implement it and get suboptimal results. The common ones are thinking of SIM as if it were antivirus. That is to say, fit and forget. You installed it, you forgot about it, you hope that it sat there in the corner and that it did whatever it needed to do, like antivirus, updated itself, quarantine stuff, and you never actually ever needed to look at it. If this is your concept of SIM, then you're in for a rude awakening. And SIM, unfortunately, is not one of those kinds of toys. You have to pay attention. And frankly, the 40% not able to find cybersecurity professionals is illustrative of this particular misconception. The second common one is to confuse SIM and logging. Logging is what the compliance standards mandate. SIEM is above that. In order to do SIEM, you must do logging. You can do logging and get compliant, doesn't mean you're secure in any way, shape, or form. So for people who come at it from the compliance standpoint, don't confuse the two. One has to do with log management, one has to do with compliance, the other has to do with extracting security value. The S in SIEM, of course, stands for security information and event management. The last two, event management, are the logging part. The first two, the security information, are the security part. Don't confuse the two of them together. Another misconception is that this technology can be handed off to somebody in the IT team who maybe already has some other work that they do. And this is going to be just another item on their plate. Unfortunately, this requires some skills in order to get value from it. And if you're not doing this as your day job, why then it's likely that you're not getting good value from your SIEM. It talks its own specialized language. It needs to be adjusted, manipulated, refined. That's some of the frustration with SIEM, is that it isn't a fit and a forget. And this can't be the 11th thing on the plate of your IT guys. Another misconception has to do with, why do you want it? What exactly do you think a SIEM is going to do for you? Well, far too often people get SIEMs simply because the neighbors have one, or they get one because the board said to get one, or they get one because the auditor said, if you don't have a SIEM, I don't know if I can pass you. And so they're not entirely sure why they want one. SIEM's weakness, if you will, is that it can do a lot of things. That's a strength, but frankly, it's also a weakness. Something that can do 15 things, what do you want it to do? So to the extent that you're not clear on what you want out of SIEM, SIEM can wind up underwhelming you. Some of the challenges that people face is that there is no standardization among log sources. So Cisco does logging one way, Windows does it another way, Fortinet does it another way, Checkpoint another way, and there seems to be no standard out there in the industry. This makes for a complex implementation depending on what you have in your particular network. And last but not the least, SIEM touches a number of domains in IT. And all too often, we see that SIEM fails because there's a power struggle in the organization as to who's going to own this and who has the right to ask for help and get help in the organization. So you might have excellent technology, clarity on use cases. You may have a dedicated owner. You may think that SIEM is something you're paying attention to, but then you can get lost in office politics and still be underwhelmed by the output. So over the years, as we've looked at thousands and thousands of installations, these are some of the misconceptions that I wanted to dispel early on. So we talk about the worst practices. Of all of the things that can go wrong, there are some that are especially common, and there are some that are especially heinous. Now, the reason we titled this SIEM worst practices is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. We figured everybody knows what best practices are, and you get those all the time. But all too often in organizations, when we show up ready to implement our SIEM, which is called Event Tracker, we find that reality is quite different than this so-called ideal world. And so this is meant to be a tongue-in-cheek to try to remind you that there's ways to get this wrong, and you should do your best to avoid getting it wrong. So we'll talk about each of these in some detail, but in brief, don't plan anything, just assume it's going to work, get something. Don't scope, never mind how many logs are going to show up, from where they're going to show up, how often they're going to show up, how long you're going to keep them. Just simply do something. Ignore the best practices. Yeah, the vendor knows what to do, but we know better because after all, we're the cat's meow. Confuse compliance and security. You came at it from a compliance standpoint and assume that security is something that you're going to get for free. That's another mistake. And last but not the least, assume that the SIEM tool is magic, that it will somehow run itself, and there's really nothing extra that you have to do. Of course, I'm being tongue-in-cheek here, and I'm saying this simply to be provocative and to show you why these kinds of thinking won't really fit. And if you think of them in this way, why then you should be ready for a suboptimal solution. So let's take the first one of those, and that is skip the planning and preparation steps. Well, the first question you ought to ask yourself, or if you're doing worst practices, not ask yourself, is what problem are you trying to solve? Did you come at this saying to yourself, I'm satisfying a compliance requirement? In which case, the auditor, the audit reports, retention, those would be the things that would be important to you. Did you think that you were doing SIEM because it was early threat detection? Okay, in that case, those use cases would come to the fore. And of course, there are people that are really more interested in logging, which is more of an operational concern. What happened on the 16th on that server? Why did it suddenly look like it acted funny? I want to go back and investigate. That's an operational problem. You can solve that with logging, which is the precursor to SIEM. But if that is your use case, it's better to recognize it as such. Following from that problem statement is clarity on who the users are. Is this something for management because they want pretty graphs? Maybe they're interested in telling the board once a month as to how evil people are in the world and how if it wasn't for them, the company would have been in trouble. Is that the use case? In which case you can set it up in a way that makes that use case happen. Or maybe it's for the security team and they're really thinking that SIEM is where they go for early threat detection. If that's what you think a SIEM is for, then your setup of SIEM will be different than merely generating pretty graphs. Did you think it was for your compliance team, for your audit team? If so, then that would change the complexion and you would plan and prepare for an audit as one of the things that you would do. Or are you thinking that this is an operational thing? If a site goes down, if a website isn't working, if you get a 404, or if an e-commerce store is misbehaving, you'll go to the logs in order to figure out why it happened and how is it that you can fix it. Operational concerns, it is a somewhat unusual use of SIEM. It's a more classic use of log management. And of course, stemming from the users and the problem you're trying to solve are the use cases. Frankly, if we had to pick the number one reason why SIEM installations are underwhelming, it's because the person that's implemented it isn't clear what they want out of it. How can you succeed when you don't have any clear picture of what success looks like? So defining the use cases, why do I want this? What data am I going to get into it? What results am I going to get out of it? Who's going to get those results? That's the planning and preparation step. And if you don't have this, then it's not surprising that your SIEM implementation is underwhelming to you. The second problem that we see people do from time to time is, and it really goes hand in glove with the planning part, is haven't given sufficient thought to log volume. The fact of the matter is, logs began 35, 40 years ago when IBM put out the S360. Right? This is 1970. And in 2019, you still have logs. Everything about computing has changed in the meantime. How is it that you still have logs? Well, the answer is they solve a fundamental problem in computing. They tell you what's going on in the machine. And whereas in the old days, it was all about figuring out whether the machine was working or not, now the use cases include security and compliance. So there's logs coming from all over the network, from cloud instances, from stuff on premise, from servers, from workstations, from network devices. Have you given thought as to what log sources are important to you? Well, this was flow from the previous slide. We thought about what use cases were important to you. Is it coming from on-premise equipment? Maybe from Active Directory, from firewalls perhaps, servers, maybe from cloud instances, Office 365 perhaps, AWS, something else? Excuse me. The second thing is, how long do you think you want to keep them? So you're getting them by the bucket load. You're getting them in hundreds of gigs per minute, per hour, per second. And you're going to keep them how long? Maybe you're keeping them only for security if that's your use case. Is a problem that happened more than 7 days ago something worth your interest? Maybe not. After all, if it's more than 7 days old, how can it be a security concern? It's over, it's finished. Or maybe you're thinking it's an operational concern and you want it around for 3 months. Is that your use case? Why then you have to worry about storage for a 3-month window as opposed to a 7-day window. Or are you thinking regulatory compliance? Auditors will routinely say, show me something from 8 months ago, 9 months ago. If that is your use case, why then maybe your retention requirements are 12 months. And if you're trying to do a combo, some for security, some for ops, some for compliance, then maybe you need all three. And maybe you need to think about online storage, nearline storage, and offline storage so that you can be optimized in terms of your storage. I mean, I know disk is cheap, but as they say in Washington, a terabyte here and a terabyte there, and pretty soon you're talking real disk. So you want to think about your retention requirements. Last but not the least, you got logs in those devices, but how did you think you were going to collect them? Well, all too often, the most efficient method turns out to be an agent or a sensor. And that's where you might run into the buzzsaw of office politics. Somebody from IT saying, wait a minute, you're going to put a sensor, an agent on my machine? Not going to happen. If you haven't thought this through and you haven't cleared that with those guys, then your project is sort of stuck. You can't get logs into the SIEM, can't get them in a timely fashion. And now what are you going to do with all that firepower? Are you going to poll for it? Are they going to arrive somehow to you by FTP? Is it going to arrive through syslog? A lot of network devices, a lot of Unix machines do this. Or do you have to go pick them up somehow through some sort of API? There is no one answer to this. It depends on the log source. If you're getting them from O365, it's an API. If it's Active Directory, probably it's an agent. If it's a firewall, it's probably syslog. If it's something like Azure, it's again an API, and so on. So you have to think about the log volume, the velocity, and the variety, the so-called 3 V's, as the second important thing vis-a-vis being successful with SIEM. By the way, as Holger mentioned, if you have questions or comments, we'd be happy to take them using the question and answer tab that you have in GoToWebinar. A third mistake that we see folks making is to treat the vendor as the enemy. The vendor sold you something, they really can't be trusted because after all, they are them and we are us. And every vendor we've ever met is only out to feather their own nest. And so we have to really treat what they're saying with some degree of suspicion. Well, I implore you, please don't have this mindset because it's not helpful. Vendors like Event Tracker are highly motivated that you should be successful. We're not selling you the product because we want you to fail, right? It's not that we have no professional pride whatsoever. We really want you to be a long-term customer. Why is that? Well, because you can act as a reference. And after all, we're professionals too. Pride is involved. We spent 12 years building this stuff. We'd like to see it do well in industry, do well for you. We'd like to see you get 101% of what you paid for. And so you're welcome to, and indeed you're implored to, requested to, ask the vendor for recommendations on how to do this right, because they're highly motivated for you to succeed. Now, vendors can also bring a bunch of best practices. After all, vendors have done this. In our own case, we've implemented some thousands of times. So we've already fallen and skinned our knees in all of the puddles, in all the different ways in which SIEM implementations can go wrong. We've evolved a methodology. How do you get from basics all the way to optimized and delivering at a maturity level 5? So there's a way that you can get there. Also, SIEM success is sometimes dependent on the vertical. You have to do things a little differently in healthcare, then maybe you have to do in finance, then maybe you have to do in government, then maybe you have to do in retail. Very often, SIEM vendors will be intimately familiar with your vertical. If you're thinking compliance, and you're in multi-location retail, PCI DSS is going to look a little different than if you're a government entity and you have the government auditor on your back for NIST 800-171. Guess what? Your SIM vendor probably knows how best to get you out and into production. And then, of course, 3/4 of the problem is not the SIM, but it's the log source. SIM has nothing to do if the log source doesn't really provide logs. But log sources are so varied. We saw it in the previous slide. Office 365, firewalls, network load balancers, Active Directory. Vendors are so different, there is no standardization. So a lot of the problem tends to be getting logs into the system, configuring those log sources in a manner that they will actually emit the stuff you want. A lot of SIM implementations fall apart because the SIM vendor says, oh, I don't know, until you get me the logs, I can't do anything. And IT is stuck because they don't have the knowledge, don't have the expertise. It may be your first time dealing with a SIM, but it's probably the 1,000th time for the vendor. So you should take advantage of your SIM vendor and their recommendations. Last but not the least, SIM vendors often have a strategy for tuning, for what we call the output-driven approach. All too often you see people collecting everything in the kitchen sink. And it's all about volume and variety, velocity, and they don't know what to bring in and what not to bring in. That's a challenge. It requires judgment. It requires an understanding of your use cases. And bringing everything in can make it miserable because it will bloat and the good stuff won't show up. It won't be organized in a proper manner where it can be fast. So SIM vendors often have a strategy for tuning. After you manage to get them reporting, how do you get only the good stuff in? How do you prioritize it? What's called an output-driven approach. If I have no use for something at all, why then I probably shouldn't ingest it at all. If I only need it for long-term storage, then I should store it in a manner that is consistent. I can't put everything on a solid-state disk, and I shouldn't be moving everything to Glacier either. They have their cost characteristics, and so your vendor has probably understood all of these over the years. And so to the extent that you interact with and work with your vendor, you're probably going to get much better off. So those are the top 3. A couple more for your consideration. We talked about how some people back into SIM because of a compliance need. They didn't really think they wanted a SIM. What they really wanted was to get the auditor off their back. But the way they read the compliance standard, and some guys in IT are pretty smart, they know that there's budget for stuff. And so they figured out what they have budget for. The organization has decided it's going to buy something for compliance. So the IT guy is pretty smart. He knows that if that's what you're going to spend money on, that's what I'm going to call it. But then I'm going to satisfy my secret desire. Why, by the way, can you shake loose money for compliance? Well, you get to go upstairs and say, we have to do this. Otherwise, the auditor is going to find us lacking. And hell, we may even get on the wall of shame. Health and Human Services, for example. When people didn't comply with HIPAA, they would post their names as HIPAA violators at hhs.gov. So some people who couldn't care less about the auditor became nervous that their good name was being ruined because they were on a wall of shame. And that immediately made management wake up and allocate budget. So buyers sometimes shake loose budget for compliance. And so you've backed in now to a SIM. You've gone to compliance, you said, what do I need to be compliant? Someone said log management. Someone else said, oh, log management, that's really called SIM. And so you backed into SIM. But don't be confused. Compliance is not security. Even though every audit standard says you should be doing logging, the fact of the matter is it's a chicken and an egg question, and it's one that we get all the time. I got budget for compliance, Should I do that first or should I be secure first? That's the question that I get asked from time to time. But it's a trick question. It's the same as chicken and egg. The reality is, you know from the industry news how many organizations are reporting being hacked. And I remind you that every single one of them was probably compliant or found to be compliant by an auditor, in spite of which they were hacked. So the reality is, if you are secure, why then you will surely be compliant. But if you are compliant, it doesn't follow that you will be secure. Now that said, there's the practical problem of getting budget. So if you've gotten budget for compliance, you want to come for the compliance, but you want to stay for the security. Just be clear in your mind, and just be clear in everyone's mind though, that compliance is not security. Now, if you think about security, then you need to be thinking in terms of prioritization. Where do you think you're going to get hurt more? Well, obviously the softer targets. So you want to try to defend the softer targets, or in some cases you could do this through risk prioritization. Not all assets are equal. Some assets, if they're compromised, is going to hurt you much more. You know, the crown jewels, you want to protect them in the Tower of London. Loose change, you want to keep it in the side drawer. If you try to protect everything like as though it's the tower, you're going to be very frustrated and you're going to need enormous amounts of budget. And so very often, the first step to identifying compliance with security is to identify what are the assets that you need to protect. It goes back to our first use case or our first slide where we said, if you don't know what you're trying to do, if you don't know from where you're trying to get data, why then it's no surprise that your SIEM implementation is underwhelming to you. The next point to think about, especially if you're backing in from a compliance standpoint, is, hey, guess what? The SIEM showed you that there's a problem. You managed to get it configured right, with the right log sources, and now it's blinking red. Who's going to do something now? Somebody, right? Who is that somebody? You need to have that identified, and that's part of the gig insofar as security is concerned. Now, as Holger mentioned, fully 40% of the audience said in the survey that the big problem with getting value from SIEM was the lack of staff. Well, IT cybersecurity skill shortage is a global phenomenon. We run a SOC. We deal with 16 billion logs every day. We have hundreds of customers that trust us to do the SOC pieces for them. We're hiring in the dozens to the hundreds of analysts. We have a problem. You have a problem, and you're probably hiring a handful, or maybe even just one or two. Finding them, training them, keeping them is a challenge because of the skill shortage that you have in industry. So it's tempting then for many people to buy into marketing hype that SIEM is magic. All you got to do is buy it, install it onto the network, and forget about it. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you want episodic success where sometimes once in a blue moon something chirped and you could declare victory, then fine. You know, by magic, even a stop clock is right twice a day. But if you want sustained success, if you want to be successful day in and day out, week in and week out, over everything in the network, then your requirements are going to be a little different. Not just the technology, but the other two pieces which are so key, people and process. And all too often it's the lack of people which is preventing SIEM from realizing its potential. Indeed, in our own experience over the last dozen years, it's our view that people and process are worth nearly 80% of being successful with SIEM. That the technology itself is really worth only 20%. Frankly, there are many excellent providers of SIEM technology, And you could solve that problem with Event Tracker or a number of other solutions. But what makes the difference at the end of the day are the processes that you have in place, if any, and the people behind the SIM. That's really what makes it sing and dance. So assuming that the SIM is going to run itself is a non-starter. Somebody needs to know it. Somebody needs to keep up with it. Making sure that it's up to date, that it's configured right. Also, as I mentioned, so it said something. When it said something, did you know how to do something about it? Do you know how to respond to incidents? Do you know how to do reporting upstairs? After all, the board's going to ask you, right? What were the episodes last month, last week? Do you know how to go hunt? Or are you waiting for alarms to go off and you're being purely reactive? Again, not having staff will prevent you from using a SIM in this manner. You'll be reduced to being what we call an alert monkey. When the alert goes off, the monkey jumps up and down. Nice, better than doing nothing, but it's a very, very low or poor value. So when Holger showed you that more than 50% of the audience thought that they were getting poor value out of their SIM, this is one of the big reasons for it. You really need to think like Chuck Norris. You've seen the ads, right? Chuck comes around and says, 15 minutes a day, and you too can look like this. Well, I ask you, how many people do you know walking around that look like Chuck Norris? I'm guessing not a whole heck of a lot. Certainly not here. It takes all kinds of skills to make a SIM successful. You have to be an expert in various kinds of technology, depending on what you have in your network. Maybe you've got Cisco, maybe you've got Microsoft Windows, Office 365, Linux, Mac OS, cloud stuff like AWS, Azure. The latest thing, endpoint detection and response, EDR technology, intrusion detection, vulnerability scans, right? DNS. For you to be successful with your SIM, you need to have expertise with a lot of these, because these are log sources that will come into SIM that will chirp and say something's wrong. When they do chirp, does somebody on your staff know what this means? What to do about it? The answer is too often no, because having these kinds of skills in a small organization is a ludicrous ask. There's nobody that knows all of this stuff cold. So in fact, it takes a number of people in order to be able to make that SIM be successful. Aside of the technology pieces, there are the process pieces that you have to pay attention to. Project discipline, the recording of the incidents, and what is it that was done in order to respond to them so that you have a record. And then, of course, the review. What happened yesterday? What happened last month? For a button-down operation that is continuously successful against a variety of attackers, this is what it takes to be successful with SIM. So people is in fact one of the big problems, and people in process is what causes SIM implementations to become somewhat unsuccessful. Now, a successful SIM is definitely within reach. We've done it hundreds of times, and you can have a successful SIM as well. But I'll remind you that the first thing is you have to accept that SIM technology is sort of complex. This isn't a fit and forget kind of thing. And so you have to accept that. What that means is you need to think about it for the need for a specialist. This is not true for other security technology. For instance, what kind of specialty do you need in order to install an antivirus? Not a whole heck of a lot. An IT guy can do it. But your generic IT guy probably can't deal with a SIM. It is in fact quite specialized. And so that's something to bear in mind and accept. If you dump this on a generalist, one who knows IT, the chances of success somehow become compromised. But there's the problem. Specialists are not that easy to come by. Second thing is we talked about planning as number one. Well, as the old saying goes, if you fail to prepare, then prepare to fail. You really want to lose this early on. Setting the expectations of the folks inside, of your vendor, of your partner, and then planning this properly is foundational. You don't do this, and your chances of having a successful SIEM implementation got reduced quite a bit. You might get lucky, but then the odds are that you probably won't because you don't have a good idea what success really looks like. Before you embark on SIEM, make sure that you solve the office politics problem, if in fact there is any. Depends on the organization. As the organization gets larger and larger, there is this possibility that you have this ugly beast or politics get in the way. Power struggles come into the picture. Who is in charge? Is this a security thing? Is it a operations thing? What happens when it rolls into production? If the SIEM finds something, who's going to react? All too often, we've seen cases where one team refuses to do something, even though the SIEM said something, because of the power struggle. So even though you might have solved every other problem, now all of a sudden, SIEM isn't giving you the value that you hoped you'd get. Now, the good news, after having spread such a lot of doom and gloom, is that you're not alone. The most popular method for implementing SIEM these days is something called co-managed SIEM. Right? Expertise is available from vendors such as Event Tracker. We not only provide the technology, but can also provide it as a managed service. This is called a co-managed solution. And over the last 3 or 4 years, this is one of the most exciting developments in the SIEM arena, that vendors have understood that buyers really want the experience. They don't necessarily want the technology, and they certainly don't want the frustration of having to get this right. So if SIEM is something that you're thinking about or have been bitten by, think about a co-managed SIEM as a way to solve a lot of these problems and go from being underwhelmed to actually getting value out of your security dollars. In a fractional SOC, that is a SOC like the one we have, you can get that village to raise your child. You can get specialists in all sorts of technologies. You can get process discipline. You can get what are called mad skills, which you probably need, coupled with the process discipline. And that's what makes the difference between getting technology versus getting successful outcome. I'll also remind you that there is a line that you shouldn't cross. Again, this is our opinion. And that is, anytime we say the word co-managed, the word outsourced sort of creeps in and people start to get nervous. Am I losing control? Is my life in somebody else's hands? Am I ever going to be able to know what's going on? Or will I be left to deal with some nonsensical alerts that some SOC that doesn't understand me has started to give? It doesn't have to be that way. And in any case, you shouldn't be relinquishing admin control of your network to any third party. You should retain that, keep it. It's on them to provide you actionable intelligence. But once they provide it to you, why then it should be on you with your administrative credentials to react and to do the incident response piece. This is what's called co-management. Everybody has their swim lane and everyone is expert and focused in their particular area of expertise. So you don't have to do this all by yourself. If you bought a SIEM 3 or 4 years ago, then you almost surely you bought something that you had to do yourself. Today, nearly 80% of the SIEMs that are sold are really sold as a managed service. And that number is only climbing. Why is it climbing? For all the reasons that we saw. Most of all, buyers want outcome. Buyers don't want technology because technology by itself didn't solve any problem. It's that combination of people and process and technology that gets you outcome. And that, after all, is what defines a successful SIEM. Now, if you're wondering what have we done with it, what our SOC has done with it, I invite you to our website called Catch of the Day. It's on our website, eventtracker.com. I told you we review 16 billion events on average per day. And you can believe that we've got a whole bunch of different things. If you come over to Catch of the Day, you'll see the sorts of success that we've had with SIEM in various verticals with all sorts of problems. Just a reminder to you that successful SIEM is in fact well within reach.
Thank you, Ananth. All right, Ananth, let's see. The first question here is, I see a lot about next-gen SIEM in the news. What is that, and what is next-gen about, Ananth?
Thank you. Frankly, the word next-gen is nothing but hype. Everything is next-gen. It's sort of like reduced calories. Everything is reduced calories. Reduced compared to what? Next-gen compared to what? So I wouldn't put a lot of stock in the term next-gen. However, what I would say to you is think about what SIEM is doing. Is it able to cope with the log sources that you care about? Is it able to handle the use cases that are important to you? Is it offered as a co-managed service so that you can overcome your skill shortage and get those mad skills that are needed? If in fact the answer to those questions is a yes, then the SIEM is something worth considering. If the answer is no, then what you might have is something that's hyped up by marketing people called next gen, artificially intelligent, machine learning, UE-based, power models, and all of that can mean absolutely nothing. So I'd caution you against the word next gen because it's really nothing more than marketing hype. Instead, you want to go back to basics, go back to fundamentals, and you probably won't go wrong. There's nothing new to see here, frankly. Every IT project, success is defined the same way. You got to do the hard work of figuring out what is it that you want, from where you're going to get it, who's going to be in charge, and then it's very likely that you will be successful. Don't do those. You get yourself a next gen SIEM, probably going to wind up with that 51% that's underwhelmed. Holger?
Thank you, Ananth. The next question, what are the main SIEM use cases? It seems like it must be more than just compliance, Ananth.
Yeah, so like I said, most people think about SIEM as a threat detection technology, that you've implemented antivirus, you've implemented firewall, you've implemented IDS, you've implemented vulnerability scanning, you've implemented maybe a honeynet. So therefore, you've got technology at different places in the network to try to keep you safe. The SIEM is where they all come together. And so a common use case for SIEM is to help you with early threat detection. Of course, the secondary one is compliance. And sometimes, as we noted in the webinar, people back into a SIEM because they start out with compliance. And then a tertiary use case sometimes is operational. I need to know what happened on that server yesterday because something went wrong. So I need to troubleshoot it. So some people use logging, which is a foundation for SIEM, and that becomes a use case.
Very good. The next question is, what log sources should be captured? All of them? Which ones?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, actually. So the cop-out answer is you should capture everything you need, but nothing that you don't. The problem, of course, is figuring out what is it that you need. The best way to get there is to get there by looking at your use cases. What are you trying to get out of the SIEM? For example, if you're trying to monitor who's accessing the network, why then you might need to capture logs from Active Directory if you have it, from your VPN concentrator, if you're allowing remote logins, maybe from your network devices to see who logged in there, maybe from your databases to identify what sort of access is going on. So once you identified the use cases, what you want out of it, then you can figure out what are the log sources. And then from those log sources, what are the particular logs that you might need to fulfill those use cases? This is actually quite difficult. And that's why I encourage many of the folks that are on this call to think about interacting with your vendor. After all, that's something that they have probably faced for 1,000 different installations. And they can be very helpful in getting you off the ground quickly.
Very good. There's a follow-on question also about logs, and the question is, what's your recommended duration of for how long to keep logs and how long to back them up and in the system? Ananth?
Right. So often they're driven by compliance requirements. If you're collecting logs and you think that a use case is compliance, then maybe you need to keep it for a year. PCI DSS, for instance, says so. Depending on how you fight with your auditor, it might not. They don't actually say to keep logs, but many people interpret it in that manner, or they feel comfortable with the idea that it's available for a year. From a security standpoint, you might only need them for 7 days, because how can you be reacting to such an old security event? From an operational standpoint, maybe 90 days suffices. So what we do is we ask people to think about it from those three angles and come up with these numbers, 7, 90, 365, to satisfy the different requirements. And then we can optimize the storage of data. Maybe for 7 days, you want to keep it in solid state disk, because the security use case requires a rapid response. And so you can't be churning through lots of data or spinning the disk, waiting and waiting and waiting for the answer to show up. Maybe for an operational thing, you can afford to wait a little bit longer, but it better be nearby. So it better be maybe spinning disk. So maybe 90 days suffices. For a compliance requirement, maybe after 90 days, it needs to go into somewhere like long-term storage, so-called cold storage, in which case you maybe move it offline. If the auditor shows up and they want to see that data, they will probably not want it in a minute's time, but they'll give you some notice, enough to be able to bring it back from cold storage, restore it, and get whatever it is you want out of it. So there are many different answers, and it sort of depends upon what your use cases are. What we see most commonly is 7 for security, 90 for operations, and 1 year for compliance.
Very good. The next question, how does SIEM differ from an endpoint detection solution?
Very good. So endpoint detection is all the rage. In fact, Event Tracker is introducing an EDR solution next week at the RSA conference. And this has led to some people asking this question. SIEM, as we defined it in the slides, is the ability to take data from a number of sources in the organization, the network, and then bring them together. Endpoint detection is specifically about protecting the endpoint. In the old days, this was called antivirus. After that, it was called endpoint protection. These days, it's called EDR. And it's one element of safeguarding your network, not to be confused with SIEM.
All right, we have one more question. And this one is, I guess it's about compliance as well. The question is, I am in the European Union. Are there any nuances or considerations for someone outside of the US?
Yes, there are, but they are in the form of compliance regulations. So if you're in the EU, then you're probably really concerned about GDPR. And so if you're backing into this from a compliance standpoint, GDPR is probably driving you. If you're in Australia, it's going to be the NDB standard, and so on. But from a technology and a security standpoint, there's really no difference between securing a network in the EU versus securing one in the United States. If you are shopping for a managed service, then make sure that it's 24/7 so that they're awake anytime you need them to be awake. You might need to do some checking that the technology can handle your particular language. But aside of that, there's no other special consideration for being in the EU.
Very good, and thank you, Ananth. This was very insightful. And with that, we're at the finish line for today's session. As we're closing this webinar, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I would also like to thank you, Ananth, for sharing your insights on SIEM worst practices and how to sidestep the common mistakes and unlock SIEM's true potential. Thank you, Ananth.
Thank you all.
Now, this concludes today's session. I hope we will see all of you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.